If there's one thing that I personally have learned from my own relationship with the global church, it's that God has created us to further his kingdom together. We aren't supposed to do it alone because there's so much that we can learn from one another. For me, it was the church in Vietnam that taught me how to sing praises to the Lord in the midst of hardship. And the church on the Navajo reservation taught me about worship. The church in Japan taught me how to stand firm against cultural apathy. The church in Bolivia taught me what faith looks like in the midst of material poverty. These are lessons that I don't think I would have learned if I had not been able to travel to worship among my brothers and sisters, and how limiting my view of God would have been if I had not been blessed to learn from them.
Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions, a podcast that takes an honest yet hopeful look at the things that the church does in the name of missions. A podcast that seeks to inspire Christ followers to rethink the status quo of short-term missions and to forge a better way forward. We feature honest conversations with people from all over the world, those who go on mission trips and those who host them. And we don't shy away from tackling the hard and uncomfortable questions. Questions like, what happens to our valuation of people when we think of them as the mission field? When we relegate churches to that sort of box, is it really possible to think of them as our equals, or to see them as potential partners in service? I'm Forrest Inslee, Professor of Global Studies at Northwest University in Seattle, and co-editor of the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions. In this episode, you'll hear from both me and my co-editor, Angel Burns, as we describe two crucial themes that resonate throughout the essays in this collection. We'll explain why thinking in terms of global church and in terms of what we call copowerment can help us to develop a new paradigm for short-term missions. Friends, there are better ways to love and serve the world, and it starts with courageous conversations. Welcome to Reimagining Short-Term Missions.
My name's Angel Burns, and I am the co-editor of Reimagining Short-Term Missions. This collaborative book has many important themes that run throughout its chapters, and one of those is this concept of the global church. If you're someone who is interested in learning how short-term trips might fit into this larger global church concept, then you're in the right place. Let's talk about short-term trips, the pros and the cons, and how having a global church mindset can help alter the way we connect with one another cross-culturally. Several years ago, as part of my work at my church here in Washington, I went to visit a thriving ministry in Mexico that hosted short-term teams like a well-run summer camp. We toured the facility, heard about their ministry, and prayed together. Since part of our trip was to scope out potential partnerships, I asked them what their involvement was with the short-termers who came every summer. And I'll never forget our two hosts looking at each other, chuckling, and saying, "Oh, we figured out the secret to hosting short-term teams. We just don't let them anywhere near the community or the people we're here to minister to." Instead of connecting with the locals, their trips included tours around their compound, but only within the compound walls, redoing projects that previous teams had already worked on, conversations with the missionaries, and tours to different locations in Mexico. But there was no involvement with the people that this ministry was working with or the community members that surrounded them. And now I can really relate to how these missionaries felt. It's often the safer path, and most people who have been involved in cross-cultural ministry have at least one story of short-termers damaging their long-term ministry. I remember when I had been in Sweden for just a few weeks, my host, who had been there for years, tentatively asked me what my thoughts were on short-term trips. We had just hosted a small team that focused on evangelism in the city we lived in, which was a city with about 94% immigrants and refugees. And I had watched as the great intentions of this really kind team met the reality of streets lined with Somalian gang members and Muslim imams. And I remember watching as the long-term missionary stood in the back while the teams went about their mission. Later, she confided in me that she was really uneasy being seen with the team because she didn't know how it would affect her standing in the community that she had lived in for years. And while most hosts can relate to these stories, we still end up accepting short-term teams year after year. And there's many reasons for that, but the reality is short-term trips aren't going anywhere. They have become the primary way that the church around the world engages with one another. So when we set out to create the book Reimagining Short-Term Missions, we wanted it to be a collaborative book where we get to hear honest, raw experiences from people all over the world who have engaged with SEMs, whether as a host or as a sending church. And what I love about this book is that it provides us with all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly of short-term missions. But for me, I realized that it really isn't a book just about short-term trips, the best practices, or cool stories from the field. It's a book about the global church and how we can begin to alter the negative experiences surrounding short-term trips when we understand that we are part of one global church that truly is better together. What we currently have in the STM movement is two primary groups of people. There are those that are adamant that short-term trips have caused harm and should end for good. And there are those who have seen the positives of short-term trips and will never be dissuaded from continuing them. Because of these two extreme perspectives, I found that using the language of global church is not only accurate, but also really helpful in explaining what this book is about and really what our focus should be on when we talk about sending a small group of people to a different culture for a short period of time. We all know that short-term trips have transformed the concept of missions. Previously, when you said the word missions or missionary, people used to imagine long-term missionaries packing their belongings in their coffins and setting off to an unreached people group. But not anymore. Now they're imagining groups of teenagers in matching t-shirts boarding the plane to Mexico for spring break. Globalization has been a large part of the STM shift, with technology allowing us to both connect and travel to areas that were otherwise out of the question. We now have universities sending college students to Burkina Faso and youth groups landing in Honduras. Short-term missions truly have become the way in which we, the church, engage with one another. So we need to be really careful how we frame these trips, which is why both terms, copowerment and global church, can really be very helpful when we think about how we want to reimagine short-term missions. So when I use the term global church, it's really quite simple. The global church is what we call every person that belongs to the Christian faith in every part of the world. It's the broadest term that I could think of. It encompasses all denominations, ethnicities, languages, and cultures. When God looks at his church, he sees all of us, those in the African bush and those in the American pew. If God views all of us as his united church, then why aren't we attempting to view ourselves in the same way? When we do this, it helps us break away from the us versus them ideology that can be so prevalent in short-term trips. And instead, we teach ourselves and short-termers that when we go on one of these trips, we're visiting our brothers and our sisters who are equal to us in every way, and often have a great deal to teach visiting teams and vice versa. I was only 13 years old when I went on my first short-term trip. A group of middle school girls boarding a plane with our chaperones and landing in Arizona, ready to serve in the Navajo Nation. During our preparation meetings, I remember our leaders saying, "You'll be so surprised. We're going there to bless them, but they'll end up blessing us." This phrase was always followed by some uncomfortable laughter that I can now translate as, "Well, that'll be a shock. We don't have any need to be blessed. And anyways, that's not our role. We're the ones that are supposed to do the blessing. We're the fill in the blank, Americans, educated, white, rich." While I did learn a lot in those first trips, the sad part is knowing that I and so many others have to now unravel the belief that there is an us and a them when it comes to the global church, instead of a we. The teams that I was part of always went to do ministry or to serve the nationals. In the case of the Navajo Reservation, we partnered with a small but resilient Navajo church. Unfortunately, I don't remember a single time where the national leaders were in a position to teach us anything. It just wasn't expected, and that breaks my heart because I know that I missed out on so much knowledge and greater understanding of God, mission, and the world because we didn't approach them with a global church mindset. Later on in my ministry, I would lead teams to Tokyo, Japan. Back home in the States, I would speak about these trips, and I'd tell stories of how the teams would exchange testimonies with church members, worship together, minister alongside one another. And at some point, I would inevitably be asked by someone, "But what did you do there?" And this is because traditional short-term missions tends to miss out on the understanding that the beauty of short-term trips is often found in simply being together. This is the part of the short-term mission experience that we want to hold on to. Short-term trips can reflect a piece of heaven on earth when they share and celebrate diverse cultures, theology, understanding, identity, and worship. This is what my teams, along with the Christ followers in Japan, were doing. We were simply being the church, not the American church or the Baptist church or the Western church, but the global church. Like my trips to Japan, I believe that short-term missions can be used as part of global ministry among the global church. In fact, I think it's necessary. But what we must realize is that STMs are not the end result of the ministry. They're part of a much larger story, the story of our global faith played out in our globalized world. When we speak about short-term missions within global ministry, we must realize that we are simply one part of a larger whole. We in the Western Church must refuse to isolate ourselves by limiting our involvement with the rest of the church to youth group short-term missions. We must open our eyes and dive into relationships that will push our understanding of who God is and what faith looks like. I truly believe that this is the heart of God in this specific time in history. It's that we build one another up across cultures and continents, joining together in unity as the global church. If there's one thing that I personally have learned from my own relationship with the global church, it's that God has created us to further his kingdom together. We aren't supposed to do it alone because there's so much that we can learn from one another. For me, it was the church in Vietnam that taught me how to sing praises to the Lord in the midst of hardship. And the church on the Navajo reservation taught me about worship. The church in Japan taught me how to stand firm against cultural apathy. The church in Bolivia taught me what faith looks like in the midst of material poverty. These are lessons that I don't think I would have learned if I had not been able to travel to worship among my brothers and sisters, and how limiting my view of God would have been if I had not been blessed to learn from them. In our globalized world, creative STMs can be used to form connections where we're sharing encouragement, mutuality, and fellowship. So my prayer for Reimagining Short-Term Missions, the book, as well as this podcast, is that by sharing the voices of Christians all over the world who are invested in ministry through short-term missions, that we will all come together and reimagine what a reformation of short-term trips might look like. When we honestly share with one another about our successes, our failures, our misunderstandings, it's then that humble obedience can meet creative expectation as we eagerly stand ready to be part in the work that God is doing through us, the global church.
Hey friends, this is Forrest again. Angel has just described the emphasis on global church that is a theme of so many of the essays in the book. I'd like to take a little time to follow up on that theme and to introduce another of the book's central ideas, one that we have come to call copowerment. Now, if you've never heard that word before, no worries. It's a new word that we coined because there was no other word that adequately described the dynamic that we feel is so important to all of us working together as the global church. And let me explain. Over the years, through my involvement with missions and community development work, I've come to understand a hard truth, that even though people like me really care about helping others, sometimes the things we do are less than helpful. Sometimes, in fact, they do overt harm to the communities they're meant to help. When I served as a long-term missionary in the Middle East, I became increasingly disturbed by assumptions on the part of visiting Western experts about the communities they came to serve. These foreign workers, probably without realizing it, acted in ways that communicated a belief that they always knew better than the locals about what was best for addressing their needs. Not only would they dictate what needed to be done in order to make life better for the community, they also tended to do that work without enlisting the help of locals. To make things worse, they often imported any resources that were needed from outside the community as well. Such an approach leaves the locals with nothing to do but watch, accept, and receive. As you can imagine, that approach, while well-meaning, quite often has the effect of devaluing the ones being served, and in the long run robbing them of both dignity and initiative. At the same time, when Western workers don't seek out local wisdom and local resources, the projects they do are often out of sync with the cultural context. Then after they return to their home country, there's no sense of local ownership that's needed to sustain the projects and programs after the foreigners move on. As a long-term missionary who cared a lot about the community I was serving in, I grew dissatisfied with the social and cultural damage I was seeing done by short-term teams in the name of good works, and I vowed to figure out better approaches. To be frank, I wasn't always successful. Little by little, though, with the patient help of my friends, I learned some good and hard lessons through trial and error. I learned, for example, that it was more important to listen to the people I wanted to serve and to spend a lot of time learning before I brought my own ideas to the table. I learned that there are many kinds of expertise and that every culture context everywhere already has inherent strengths and resources and assets that can be engaged to meet social challenges. I learned that if given the opportunity and access to resources, local people, especially the resourceful poor, have enormous capacities for innovative, entrepreneurial, creative problem solving. And that when they are encouraged to find their own solutions, they tend to own them and fight for them in ways that they wouldn't do for solutions imported from a foreign context. Most importantly, I learned that any sort of cross-cultural work does not need to be based on a dynamic of one-way giving. Indeed, it can't flow only one way if we acknowledge the full humanity and worth of the people we work with. Instead, we have to discipline ourselves to work in collaborative partnership that is grounded in authentic, mutually transformative relationship. As I learned these values and lessons through my work as a missionary, my old ways of thinking about long and short-term missions was challenged and changed. In time, I came to believe that a completely new paradigm was needed, one that I eventually came to think about as copowerment. Now, to understand this term, copowerment, let me start by suggesting some of the limits of the word empowerment. As a graduate professor, I work with men and women who've chosen vocations of cross-cultural service around the world. Inevitably, in such work, we must not only learn the key terms of our professional fields, we also have to grapple with the way these terms are used and the assumptions behind them. Now, one of the words that is often used in the realm of missions work is empowerment. We speak easily, for example, of empowering local business owners for economic collaboration, or empowering churches in poor countries to create community health initiatives. Yet, as prevalent as that term is in cross-cultural work like missions, some of us have begun to ask, is empowerment really the best term to use to describe the work that we do? When you break the word down, M and power, what are the implications built into the word? Literally, the word suggests that in a given social equation, one party has power and gives it to the other who lacks it. So, if we unthinkingly let empowerment thinking shape the work we do with and for people, it has a profound impact on how we view them and consequently how we treat them. Whether we mean it to or not, an empowerment mentality suggests a power differential that puts people on unequal ground. So you can see how that word empowerment often reflects a power dynamic that operates in a one-way direction. Behind it is the implication communicated to those who receive short-term mission teams. I, as a visitor, seek to give you power that I have and you do not, to make you able to do something that you could not have done without the power I bring. But really, is that the best way we ought to be thinking about our work? What if there were a different way, a way that wasn't tied up with dynamics of power and privilege and expertise, a way that didn't objectify and distance the people we work with, a way that did not put pressure on us to slip into roles of authority based on culture and class and resources? Well, the authors of this book believe that there is, and we call this new approach to short-term missions copowerment. In the book Re-Imagining Short-Term Missions, we understand copowerment to be a dynamic of mutual exchange by which both sides of a social equation are made stronger and more effective by the other. Let me say that again. We understand copowerment to be a dynamic of mutual exchange by which both sides of a social equation are made stronger and more effective by the other. Now, in some cases, of course, the word empowerment does accurately describe the working dynamic in some situations, so there's nothing inherently wrong with the word. Yet, when it comes to meeting shared challenges in cross-cultural contexts, the values implicit in copowerment suggest a better foundation for co-equal, collaborative work. Now, to understand what happens when we don't think in copowerment terms, it might be helpful to look at a couple of case examples. Now, the first example I have in mind is a project that took place in the Philippines at a Christian center that supported women trying to find healing after life in the sex trade. One of the American groups that helped to support that ministry, a Christian running club, decided that rather than just send money, they would send a team of representatives from the group to serve these women directly. Unsurprisingly, the team members sought to serve out of their areas of expertise and passion, and so they taught the women in the recovery center all about the benefits of jogging and even provided each woman with a brand new pair of running shoes to prepare them for their new training regime. A week later, the team returned to the States, and the result of the thousands of dollars spent on shoes and airfare and hotels and spent vacation days, not a single woman ever went jogging, and the fancy running shoes sat in closets unused. You see, the reality was that jogging for any reason was simply not part of Filipino culture, and for women especially, running in public places would have been viewed as culturally inappropriate and even physically risky in that urban setting. This story is all too typical. Well-meaning people in the name of love or service or advocacy end up doing things that at best don't really make a difference in people's lives, or at worst end up making a mess of things. Now, I want to be careful to say we could admire the fact that the members of the running club wanted to do good in the world, and they even respect the sacrifices they made in an attempt to heal the trauma that sex trafficking causes. But we still should ask, what could this group have done differently? Maybe, rather than starting with the assumption that they knew what was best for the women in the aftercare center, they might have started with the assumption that they didn't know, and that in fact the women in the center probably knew more about their own geographic, social, and cultural context than they did. Maybe if they had taken the time to listen to people in that context, both Filipino clients and the recovery center staff, and to learn from them about the opportunities and challenges unique to that situation, they could probably have devised a much more effective and sustainable strategy of helping. And maybe they might not have wasted so much money, time, and effort. In short, their approach could have been one that reflected a dynamic of copowerment, and that's a core theme of this book, the practice of approaching social challenges with the intent to first learn, appreciate, and understand the people we want to serve and the environments in which they live before we attempt to work among them. Now, there's another story to be told, one that demonstrates this idea of copowerment, and it happens to have taken place in the same recovery center. It's the story of my friend and one-time student Renee, who led a short-term team to serve at this sex trafficking aftercare center in Manila. She, too, wanted to make a difference in the lives of the Filipino women in this community. However, she started with the assumption that she didn't yet know what she needed to know to be useful. And she understood that whatever intervention she might design would have to be developed out of a deep and holistic understanding of these women and their culture. In other words, Renee knew that deep understanding needed to precede any action on her part, and that such understanding could only have come through a copowerment approach that engaged the very people she wanted to help as partners, co-laborers, and co-creators. Now, like our well-intentioned runners, Renee and the others on her team had areas of passion and expertise that she wanted to share with these women. She was a trained psychologist with years of training in classical dance and ballet, and knew from experience the power of aesthetic movement to heal the soul. Now, if Renee had taken a non-copowerment approach, as so many do-gooders do, and assumed that she knew what was best for the women at the recovery center, what might she have done? Well, if she had taken the route of more typical well-meaning Westerners, she would probably have flown in for a week and attempted to teach the women some of the classical ballet movements that, based on her own experience, had brought so much healing to her own soul. With the right resources, she might even have set up a studio, complete with a wall of mirrors and a practice bar, so that the women could continue to practice the classical dance moves after she went home. And of course, you can imagine how that would have turned out. However, thinking from the start in copowerment terms, Renee first squarely faced the truth that while her impulse to help was undoubtedly good, whatever plans she might devise out of her own culture and her own experience would probably not have had the impact for healing that she hoped for. Instead, she took the time to look, to listen, and to learn. She did her research. She read all she could about Filipino culture. Even more important, she asked those who worked in the aftercare center to help her to understand the challenges that the residents there faced. She invested the time to form relationships and to engage representatives of the culture in conversations, especially people connected to the Women's Healing Center who understood the nature of their needs. She sought to learn and respect cultural traditions of music and dance, how they were or weren't part of the everyday experiences of Filipino women. Drawing on her own training in psychology and dance and setting that in conversation with the local knowledge and contextual wisdom of her Filipino partners, she developed a tentative model of dance movement therapy for the shelter women. And yet she developed it as a tentative model because she knew that she still had much more to learn from the very context and people she wanted to serve. To that end, and under the guidance of Filipino leadership, she invited both clients and staff at the center to participate in a prototype of this approach. Then afterwards, she took the stance of one who still had much to learn, asking for extensive feedback and soliciting new ideas for improving the program. In this co-powering dynamic, both visitors and hosts walked alongside one another as collaborators and co-creators of this new context-based approach to healing through dance movement. As you might imagine, the response to this approach was drastically different from the reaction to the running club's efforts. Because this particular sort of healing dance was located in the particularities of place, grounded in indigenous values and informed by local wisdom, the shelter residents resonated with it and acknowledged positive results even from the initial prototype activities that she was testing out with their help. And rather than being passive recipients of an imported methodology, the staff and clients at the Recovery Center were inspired to own and even take responsibility for this process of movement therapy, a process that, in fact, even now, several years later, continues to be part of the healing activities of the center. So you can see that copowerment ideals make space for all stakeholders to bring their ideas, capacities, and resources to the table as they empower one another. And that, of course, requires us to be humble, but it also allows us to build authentic, honest, co-equal relationships with members of the global church.
You've been listening to the Re-Imagining Short-Term Missions podcast. If you want to explore more diverse and challenging perspectives like this, check out a new book called Re-Imagining Short-Term Missions, which includes chapters written by our podcast guests and from many more STM innovators from around the world. Your podcast host is Forrest Inslee, co-editor of that book and a professor of global studies at Northwest University in Seattle. Angel Burns is the book's co-editor, and our podcast producer is Heath Hollinsby. Friends, what we need now is nothing short of a revolution in short-term missions. So please help us spread the word by sharing this podcast with others of like heart and mind. This is the time for reimagining short-term missions.